opening the center immediately, controlling key squares and preparing swift development. Embracing the king's Indian setup immediately, black prepares to fianchetto their bishop, aiming for long-range pressure. Instantly stakes claim to the center, creating a tense pawn chain and inviting early confrontation for piece development. Pivoting the bishop to the long diagonal immediately contests white's central pawns. Developing a knight to c3 reinforces the central pawns and prepares for potential attacks on the king side. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this move quietly develops black's pawn structure. Challenging black's fianchetto with aggressive pawn thrusts, white aims to seize the initiative by opening lines and potentially creating attacking opportunities. Developing this knight to its natural outpost strengthens the central pawn chain and prepares for kingside castling. Developing another knight solidifies central control and prepares for kingside castling, a standard but effective way to enhance king safety. Securing the monarch heralds a shift toward consolidating forces and preparing for central engagement, a vital defensive maneuver. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal aims to control crucial central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. This piece placement, while seemingly straightforward, sets the stage for a dynamic middle game, potentially pressuring black's kingside if an attack materializes. Shifting the knight to d7, an unassuming but vital maneuver, aims to reinforce the e5 square and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, perhaps with c5, thus contesting white's central pawn mass and opening lines for black's pieces to become more active. Securing the king behind a pawn shield brings immediate peace of mind, consolidating white's central grip and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Challenging white's central pawn dominance, black immediately fights for space and initiates a dynamic pawn exchange that will likely open lines for both sides, potentially leading to exciting tactical skirmishes. Sealing the center with the pawn thrust dramatically shrinks black's kingside attacking options while simultaneously preparing a powerful queenside expansion, creating significant spatial advantage and initiating a strategic battle for control of the open files. Black embraces the center's confrontation, aiming to liberate their queenside and potentially open lines for their pieces. This pawn sacrifice initiates a dynamic struggle for central control, promising an exciting middle game where piece activity will be paramount. Opening the central files precipitates a sharp tactical engagement, forcing a reevaluation of pawn structures and piece activity. Reclaiming the pawn opens up a crucial diagonal for your dark-squared bishop, promising active counterplay against white's central pawn mass and creating immediate tension on the e-file. Provoking a pawn storm towards the king's flank, this knight leap aims to exploit the open f-file and create immediate threats against the weakened dark squares around black's castled monarch. Injecting dynamic counterplay, the knight scurries to b6, eyeing the advanced pawn and aiming to disrupt white's central control while creating escape squares and reinforcing the queenside. Asserting territorial dominance on the queenside, white's pawn push disrupts black's established structure and creates an immediate pawn chain threat, potentially opening lines for future piece development or even initiating a queenside expansion that could overwhelm black's less active pieces. Re-establishing piece contact across the center, this knight anchors itself on a vital square, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's advanced pawn structure and offering support for its brethren. Pressuring black's queenside structure, white initiates a bold pawn push to dislodge the knight and gain a foothold on the now exposed b6 square, potentially opening lines for future queen or rook incursions. Disrupting the knight's central influence, this pawn advance creates a crucial diagonal confrontation for the bishop and forces a white piece to reevaluate its forward post, potentially unlocking further pawn breaks later. Shattering the queenside pawn structure offers a surprising positional trade-off. While sacrificing a pawn temporarily, white aims to gain long-term compensation through the permanently weakened black pawn chain and the opening of the file for potential queenside pressure. Sacrificing the pawn opens a tactical minefield, immediately challenging white's centralized knight and aiming to disrupt its aggressive spearhead before it can fully consolidate. Black is gambling that the tempo gained in exposing White's king will outweigh the material deficit, creating dynamic counterplay by reactivating the previously hemmed-in knight and opening lines for the rook on the h-file. This is a bold decision, prioritizing active piece play and king safety over material equality, and the coming exchanges will dictate whether this calculated risk pays off or leaves Black in a precariously exposed position. Unleashing the queen aggressively, White aims to exploit the exposed Black king and create immediate threats, though this daring sortie might expose White's own monarch if Black can consolidate. Black solidifies their central grip, but the e6 pawn now becomes a significant target for White's bishop and knight, potentially creating imbalances later. Capitalizing on the exposed king-pawn and the disrupted pawn structure, White decisively seizes the opportunity to shatter Black's queenside defenses. Unleashing the d-pawn cracks open the center, a daring gambit to disrupt White's entrenched king's side and open lines for your pieces. But beware the tactical consequences of abandoning central control too hastily. Securing the bishop and preparing for a potential advance on the king side are the primary goals here, though it does slightly concede central control for the moment. The positional structure has become quite complex. White's pawn on d5 cramps Black's kingside, while Black's own pawns storm on the queenside, exemplified by the advance of the c-pawn, creates dynamic counterplay. The capture on g5 was a critical turning point, opening lines for White's queen and knight and fundamentally altering the tactical landscape. Black's response, pushing the d-pawn, aimed to disrupt White's central presence and create threats. Now, by repositioning the bishop to d3, White fortifies the g2 diagonal and ensures that the piece remains active, ready to participate in the unfolding middle game battle. It's a move that prioritizes piece development and solidifies the pawn structure, even if it temporarily allows Black to maintain a slight pawn majority in the center. The game is far from decided, with both sides poised to exploit weaknesses in the opponent's camp. Suddenly, the center erupts, forcing Black to reevaluate the immediate tactical landscape. Accepting the pawn relinquishes central control, but clears a diagonal for the bishop and potentially opens lines towards the king side. Shattering Black's central pawn structure opens a diagonal for the queen, now poised to exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. Unleashing a disruptive bishop check, Black immediately targets the king's sanctuary, forcing White's king to abandon its protective pawn shield and creating an immediate tactical conundrum. This bold foray exploits White's exposed king position after the aggressive pawn thrusts and promises an exciting, albeit potentially dangerous, middle game for both sides. Seeking refuge, White endeavors to reposition the king away from the immediate dangers of the open diagonal, aiming to consolidate defenses amidst the growing chaos on the queen side and the exposed nature of the kingside pawns. Seeking to break White's grip and open lines for counterplay, Black gambits a pawn to disrupt the pawn chain and activate the bishop. Initiating a bold pawn thrust, White seeks to pry open lines and exploit Black's slightly uncoordinated pieces. The ambition here is to disrupt Black's pawn chain and create attacking chances, though it simultaneously weakens White's own king position and invites tactical ripostes. This pawn sacrifice might lead to a dynamic middle game if Black isn't careful. Opening a critical diagonal for your queen to menace the White king, this capture sacrifices a pawn, but fundamentally disrupts White's pawn structure and creates immediate tactical complications. You're forcing White to reevaluate their king's safety and consider defensive maneuvers instead of continuing their attack. The resulting pawn chains will be more dynamic, offering attacking potential. White asserts control over the vital center squares and opens lines for an aggressive kingside assault. Unleashing the queen to potentially disrupt White's central control and seek counterplay against the now exposed king, this maneuver forces a crucial decision for White. Either reinforce the king's safety or continue an aggressive development that might leave it vulnerable. Unleashing a knight to challenge the bishop's diagonal and probe the king's exposed position, this move injects immediate tactical intrigue and forces Black to carefully reassess the safety of their monarch amidst the crumbling pawn structure. Black's queen boldly ventures into the center, challenging White's knight and disrupting its defensive posture around the king. This aggressive positioning demands immediate attention, as it could open up lines of attack if white's pieces are not harmoniously repositioned. Unlocking the kingside's latent aggression, the knight's repositioning aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure and pressure the f-file once the central tension resolves. Seeking to rearrange forces and bolster the kingside defense, black repositions the knight to a potentially more active square, eyeing the central outpost and preparing for future pawn advances. Seizing the initiative by removing a key defender, white liberates the central light-squared bishop to exploit the newly opened diagonals targeting black's compromised kingside pawn structure.